Hello. As we all know, it's been a pretty stressful year, so today I want to talk about something that was a defining part of my youth. Now, what could that be, you ask? Is it a first love? That song you played all summer long? No. It's the behind-the-scenes features on the Lord of the Rings Extended Edition DVDs. You see, for people like me who were too young to see these movies when they came out, a lot of us discovered them at home, and I think that fundamentally changed how we watched them. Like, my attention span was already pretty low then, so even though I think I watched these movies all the time growing up, I would usually just skip to the big fight sequences, or more often than not, I'd be watching the behind the scenes. Because before the days of YouTube and 10-hour me and my boyfriend do a blood ritual challenge videos, these things were like my go-to comfort watches. In my early teen years, I used to fall asleep to them almost every night. It was either that or my sister's DVD copy of Grease. Maybe that's why I made such a big deal about enjoying the fight sequences so much, is because deep down, I was a pink lady. But it wasn't just me. The Lord of the Rings behind-the-scenes documentaries have gained this cult-like status in fans, like almost as much as the movies themselves once had.
The weird thing is that I've had just as many people come to me saying they love all the behind-the-scenes, extra stuff as the actual film itself, which is great.
And they are now widely lauded as the pinnacle of the movie behind-the-scenes documentary genre. But sadly, due to a lot of factors, that genre is kind of dying. So recently, I made the commitment to do something that I've never done before. I'm going to watch all of the Lord of the Rings behind the scenes from start to finish. But I think it's going to be worth it. I want to look past my nostalgia for these things and find out what makes them so special, and what is its legacy now that it may be the last of its kind. Other people my age are working in hospitals right now. So when production started on Lord of the Rings, I think both the studio and Peter Jackson knew that this was going to be an experience worth documenting. They were about to shoot 3 massive films all at once, which were adaptations of books widely considered to be unadaptable, with a director and a creative team who were most well known for this. And the person who was initially brought on to do that was a filmmaker friend of Peter Jackson, a guy called Costa Botes. Now, Costa and Peter had this idea of making 3 warts and all documentaries. Now, that basically means there would be no voiceovers or talking heads. They would just let their fly-on-the-wall style films tell the story itself. So Costa, along with his partner, Haley French, shot over 1,000 hours of footage during the 7-year production of these movies. But as these films came out and became global phenomenons, I think New Line started to think a little bit bigger, and that didn't really gel with Costa's vision. So in 2001, the studio hired a guy called Michael Pellerin to produce the majority of the behind-the-scenes content that we now see on the DVDs, called The Appendices. These were a collection of documentaries that were in a much more traditional style of cast and crew interviews interspersed with Costa and Haley's footage. In the end, Costa and Haley's documentaries got sidelined and never made it onto the DVDs, so even I've never seen them. Costa talks extensively about this experience on his blog, and I urge you to read it. It's like a cup of coffee. It's really refreshing to see someone speak so openly about the studio meddling that happens on these things. That is also very bitter, which you can't really blame him for, because even though Costa's documentaries did make it onto the Blu-rays, a lot of stuff ended up getting cut. For example, there was footage of orcs singing Stand By Me, but New Line didn't want to pay for the rights, which I guess understandable. The movie's only made $5 billion. And even then, the appendices use up a lot of Costa and Haley's footage, so their documentaries are kind of always destined to live in its shadow. After hearing all of this, I really wanted to get Michael's side of the story, but the only interview I could find with him online was this 2.5-hour live stream with the OneRing.net. Now, do not get me wrong, everyone at the OneRing.net are awesome, but I was 10 hours into my watch through at this point, and this nearly fucking broke me.
You had to excise the still image galleries. You had to excise the Middle-earth maps. I have to say, I missed the stuff about Thorin's father. We didn't get to see anything about Thrain, but I missed that bit, but I'm glad that I got what I got. It was so wonderful. But I have to get a little fanboy here.
There is the Creating the Lord of the Rings Symphonies.
These are all with the gift set.
Right, these are the ones with the gift set.
When I tell you it is 2.5 hours of them fondling water bottles. That guy wears the hat for all of it. But they do talk about it a little, and Michael does give good reasons why New Line took his approach. You know, even though Costa and Haley shot so much, they physically can't film everything that people have stories about. And Michael deserves huge credit in his own right for making the appendices. After all, they are the documentaries that I grew up loving. So even though this was a bit of a mess, there doesn't seem to be any bad blood between Michael and Costa, and we can now enjoy both of their work on the latest Blu-ray box set. However, I was very curious to see which approach was better, and the only way I was going to find that out was by watching all of it. So let's start with Michael Pellerin's documentaries, get the appendices out the way first. They are 20 hours in length, so that's more than half.
This my time and this my moment, God, I'm sure of this, I swear, even if
The appendices documentaries cover pretty much every aspect of the production of the trilogy, from the adaptation process to the visual effects to the cast filming on set. Not only that, there's interactive galleries, there's breakdowns of sound mixes and editing. It is truly staggering the sheer amount of content on here. So of course that means not everything on here is going to be a total home run. In particular, the first few documentaries focus on Tolkien, and that's great. It's a hugely interesting and fascinating part of the story. But I'm not going to lie to you, it's a lot of old men in armchairs with progressively terrifying backgrounds. It's not the main course, it's not what you're here for. Also, the music of Howard Shore in these movies is a total masterpiece. Everyone knows that. But because it's the only music they bothered to get the rights to, it tends to get very overused in these documentaries.
Tolkien himself was horrified at modern analogies being placed on his work. He always rejected the notion that the stories were based on World War II and the rise of Hitler and all that.
But this is the format for the whole of the appendices. It's much like any other documentary. It's talking head interviews interspersed with B-roll footage from the set. So the question, of course, becomes, what makes them so good then? Well, I think you just need to look at any behind the scenes now. You know, even the good ones are very refined and shiny and kind of overproduced for what they are. And the Lord of the Rings behind the scenes are like watching home videos from someone's drama summer camp, but instead of making a show about cyberbullying, they made the greatest film trilogy of all time.
Thief! Liar! It is mine. Bilbo Baggins, do not take me for some conjurer of cheap tricks.
Because I think the core of documentary filmmaking is getting to the truth of your subject, and the truth for so many who worked on this trilogy was that they had the time of their career. You really just need to watch the reunion they just had for these movies to see that this cast bonded like a family. I think a key point as well is that it's obviously a very male-heavy cast, so the amount of bloody boys banter on these things is out of this world.
So mine's pointing up and yours is pointing down.
Yeah, but yours is a darker colour.
The same with the hobbits where
Alright. Next time, I'm going to punch him right in the
But also, the cast is just generally one of the most chaotic groups ever. And it means that there's so much wild, hilarious shit in these documentaries. Like, if you think of something, it is in there. And I know you're thinking, surely that can't be. You know, it doesn't have John Rhys Davies explaining the rules of karate.
The great rules of karate are if you cannot stand, you cannot fight. If you cannot see, you cannot fight.
But at the end of the day, the stars of behind-the-scenes documentaries aren't the cast. And for these movies, it is the largely Kiwi crew that make these things. I genuinely believe now that New Zealand people are just the objectively most lovable people on earth. It's something about their accent or their culture. There's this unassuming nature and humility. They kind of sneak their coolness by you, like Louis Theroux. I found it genuinely hard to properly articulate my love for all these people, so I made a ranking of my favourite crew members based on the number of brick walls I'd run through for them. So on the scale of one brick wall, we have David Sallow. David is a Tolkien scholar, and he's the best thing about those documentaries. I mean, put it this way, you didn't have to tell me that this guy spoke Elvish, but he's the cutest, and I just want to hug him every time I see him. Love you, David. Another shout out goes to the two Foley artists, who, on top of doing a very underappreciated job in sound design, just seems like they had the goddamn time of their lives on these movies.
Mine's longer than yours.
And finally, at one brick wall, I want to put Fran Walsh. Fran is as much at the heart of these movies as Peter Jackson or Philippa Boyens, but she chose not to be on these documentaries for privacy's sake, and I think she doesn't get the credit she's due because of that. And on top of that, she's the voice of the Ringwraith Scream, which is very cool, but also, I didn't sleep as a kid because of that, Fran. Why did you do it? Moving up to two brick walls, I'm just going to put everyone who works at Weta Workshop. I have such a huge affinity for these nerds, they're my kind of people. Basically the kind of person who, when asked to do an interview for a DVD turns up in a Hawaiian shirt. And genuinely unmatched is the mid-production party that the miniature groups had, where they made it satanic themed. What a fucking energy.
Lord High Executioner, mighty wall.
Moving up to Three Brick Walls, we have Lani. Lani is one of the many female stunt performers that worked on these movies, and seeing her fight toe-to-toe with massive Maori stunt guys in the Helm's Deep set is probably one of the coolest things I've ever seen. She is beauty, she is grace.
Every morning and every evening, I got up and got naked, got into costume with 25 of the gorgeous bodies in New Zealand. It was awesome from my point of view.
And finally, Kieran. Do I have to say anything about him? Look at his face. Kieran is a veteran actor and skilled performer, and it's so obvious that the entire cast just fell in love with him. Also, he gets 3 brick walls because Viggo's impression of him would sustain me on a desert island.
And Kieran's going, Viggo, don't worry about me.
Now, there's one more person that I want to mention, and honestly, this whole scale is kind of pointless now because there is no limit to the amount of brick walls I would run through for this man. I would inject his nasally New Zealand timbre into my ears for the rest of my life. I am, of course, talking about co-founder of Weta Workshop, Richard Taylor. He's just an absolute enigma of a man, and I'm so fascinated by him. Because Weta Workshop has fundamentally changed the world of special effects. Like, he is a Steve Jobs level genius, but he's also got the personal manner of Wheezy from Toy Story.
We chose to look after the design, the fabrication, and the on-set operation of the special makeup effects and prosthetics.
He kind of talks like a robot, like his volume control and intonations kind of like he's reading a script, but my God, when he lets loose.
So I sort of hid it under my jacket as I walked through all the armor techs onto set so I didn't get a ribbing.
Watching all 20 hours of these things was a bit of a slog, but honestly, it very easily reminded me why they're so great. On top of all these people being fun to watch, these documentaries do the important task of giving them credit for their work that goes underappreciated no matter how many times you watch the movies. Like, for example, there was 2 guys who worked for 3 years in a bubble hand-making every piece of chainmail that you see in the movies. Where are their statues?
I would not have traded this experience for the world. It has been the most amazing time of my life.
Honestly, watching the appendices again was so great. I kind of worried for the Costa documentaries. I realised I still had to watch them, and I wondered what else they could teach me about the production of these movies. Well, something did happen when I watched the Costa documentaries, and the best way to describe it is it's something that J.K. Rowling continues to do. It's a little thing called... So the reason I wanted to revisit these behind the scenes in the first place was that I recently got to see The Fellowship of the Ring for the first time in a cinema. And of course, it was incredible as it always was, but something new happened on this watch. I found myself quite a lot pointing out stuff I recognised from the behind the scenes. I was going, oh look, there's Kieran. Oh look, there's a guy in a big rig costume. Oh look, isn't that the miniature that Richard Taylor peeks out of like it's a goddamn Lego set?
I'm standing in amongst the miniature of Rivendell.
And that kind of freaked me out a bit because these movies are a huge part of my childhood. They are magic to me. And to have that magic be broken even just for a few seconds, it made me wonder whether I had overdone it a bit in my youth. Not drugs, my documentaries were too in-depth! There are a plethora of images in these documentaries that can totally ruin any mystique you have for parts of these movies. So look away now if you don't want to see them, but if you excuse me, look at this. Look at these masks. The cave troll has a dick. Gollum has a dick. Who else has one? Did they give Treebeard one? Now that panic did fade eventually, you know, because for 99% of these movies, I am as swept up in them as I was when I was 10 years old. But it got me wondering as to whether these documentaries had the capacity to ruin the magic around these movies I had growing up. I've watched the Appendices documentaries so many times, I kind of felt like I knew what it was like to be on these movies. I felt that as a kid. But then I watched the Costa documentaries and it all came crumbling down. The constant vibe of the Appendices is that everything was great and it was the adventure of a lifetime. And the vibe of the Costa documentaries is people in offices having the most passive-aggressive exchanges I've ever seen.
Right. Okay. I don't want it to work tomorrow.
Certainly.
Thank you very much.
Her salary out of my wage if she can't work tomorrow. She's got to work tomorrow to get everything finished. If you have a problem with that, take it out of my salary. You had my
Carol,
permission. I've got her over there in tears.
They even show Peter Jackson getting a bit grumpy.
Boromir's bag is rejected as a piece of design. I don't like it.
Okay.
And that Boromir will need a bag within the next 2 or 3 days, I guess, so that they better come up with some ideas.
Now that shouldn't really be surprising, like he had the most stressful job ever. Of course there's going to be some slight tensions on set, but because I grew up with The Appendices, where he's just like this constant jolly man, this was like finding out Santa beats his elves. Now obviously it's not all negative, but the overall tone is vastly different in how it portrays the experience of making these movies. It shows that it's incredibly stressful, the weather's against them, people get pissed off and argue, and all credit to Costa and Haley, but it shows it to be getting fucking boring after a while. And now knowing that New Line tried to sideline this approach, it made me think about behind the scenes in general and how it's changed over the years. DVD behind the scenes is still a relatively new thing, but we've kind of already witnessed its birth and death in the mainstream. Now, a lot of that is up to home video dying a death, but I think it's a lot of different changes. Oh, fuck. Movie news is constantly in the actual news. Movie stars can be your friends in that very one-sided parasocial nightmare way. But more importantly, I think the trend of studio control that Costa and Haley experienced has just gotten worse. The state of behind the scenes now is so far from Costa's original warts and all vision. It is no warts. It is heavily edited sound bites that try and sell you that everyone had a great time and everything was great. And then 2 months later, it's like, no, we didn't. Joe Bob Briggs makes an amazing point about why the days of physical media were great, and it's because it put an end date on this studio meddling. Because once something gets released, they can't just take it off like if it were on a streaming service. Like, the magic of the golden era of DVD releases is that so much embarrassing shit happened and the studios can't do anything about it. Watching Costa's documentary, I kind of had a crisis of faith over my love for these behind the scenes. I always thought of these documentaries as like the gold standard, and I wondered, why don't they make stuff like this anymore? But knowing about the conflict that arose between Costa and the studio and seeing how the medium has evolved, I started to worry whether The Appendices were actually the beginning of the end. Maybe the ones that I grew up loving, they were the studio airbrushed versions of what it was really like. Maybe they were their own fantasy. Don't worry, that's just a conflict segue into the final chapter. Everything's gonna be fine.
Cause this music is my safe place, so just leave if you don't care. Cause these lyrics therapeutic, I can feel it in the air.
So as I had this crisis of faith over whether a huge part of my childhood was all just a massive lie, I started to accept something. That no matter what, The Appendices will always have made a huge impression on me. So much so that I can't help but think of it when I watch the movies now. But I started to realize that that's not necessarily a bad thing. And it actually reveals why these documentaries are so special to me. Because for those brief moments where I noticed something and I realized how it was done, it's not just jarring, it reminds me of those people that I love who don't get the credit they deserve because of the nature of their jobs. When I grew up, these films were magic. But now that I've got older, it's not that that's gone, it's just that I appreciate them on a totally different level. I used to think these movies were just unattainably great. I could never aspire to work on something that was that epic and miraculous, that it was just made by genius wizard people. And these documentaries made me realize, even as a kid, that they weren't. They were made by normal human beings who, through equal parts hard work and luck, managed to pull off the extraordinary. It is so immensely inspiring to see images that were etched onto my brain as a kid, humbled down to a couple of guys in a warehouse with action figures and an ironclad will that this wasn't going to be an embarrassment. I think both The Appendices and the Costa documentaries are very different, but I also think they tell the same core story, and that is that it is a miracle that these movies weren't a disaster. And I think the main problem with the state of behind the scenes now is that it's very easy to forget all of that. The landscape of movies now is huge blockbuster franchises that are controlled by corporations, which are under this constant, intense online scrutiny. People have become wise to this clinical and soulless, behind-the-scenes type promotion that they get sold, and it's nurtured this huge cynicism in audiences. We start to implant these reasons why a movie or a show wasn't good, and it's because this corporation is trying to ruin my childhood. When in reality, in a lot of cases, it was made by fallible human beings who worked really hard and it didn't work out. But I don't think all hope is lost for behind the scenes. The documentary that just came out about the last season of Game of Thrones is a prime example. It doesn't try to point any fingers as to why the final season was a disappointment. It just shows you people working really hard on this massive scale, and that tells the story itself. I hope we can get more documentaries that go beyond the surface level like this, because they were the same ones that inspired me. The Duffer Brothers have credited the Lord of the Rings documentaries as what inspired them to go to film school. And no matter how sanitized the appendices may be, I think that was always its purpose.
And it's an important thing to kind of pass on to the next group of filmmakers, to keep kind of getting kids excited about the idea of what films can be, and so because they are going to be the future of cinema.
Well, I think it's safe to say that it definitely has. I mean, maybe what Peter had in mind wasn't a 20-minute video where I yell about cave troll dicks, but it's what he got. For now, that's the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in 2021. Thank fucking God for that.